Hi, I'm Will Whittaker, and this is Ad Tech for Security People. So before I get started, I just want to cover some caveats here. As it says, the views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this presentation belong solely to me and not necessarily to my employer. And nothing I say here should be construed as an official position of my employer. Also, ad tech is a really big field, and while I've dealt with it a fair bit, my view is by necessity not a complete one. So there's things that I might miss that I don't know about or I haven't participated in. So just do bear that in mind. And also, by necessity, this is a simplified view of the ad tech ecosystem. The reality is much, much more complicated than this, but we've got 20 minutes, so I've kind of tried to condense things down to get the idea of what's happening here, but not overwhelm you with details. So just to give you an idea of who this talk is for, it's really kind of generated out of a series of conversations I've had in my own security teams when people join from outside of ad tech and they come in on the security team. They're now dealing with ad tech for the first time, and they don't really understand how it works, what the security implications of it actually are. But they're suddenly responsible for protecting those things. And this might look like you find yourself in an organization where you find out that the application is being monetized in some way via ad tech, or the marketing department is using ad tech in some way to generate revenue or to make sales happen, and you're responsible for securing that, and you need to know how it works, and you need to be able to understand how to build threat models around that and how that works. So that is who this talk is for, essentially people who look a little bit like me. So first, some basics. Just to get it's a field with a lot of jargon, so I want to kind of get you familiar with some of the very basic jargon around this that is going to keep coming up over and over again, especially if you do any online reading about this. You'll see these terms, and I want to make sure that everyone understands what's going on here. The audience is just all of the people with browsers who are seeing ads. Publisher is somebody who owns a site, an application, whatever that they want to run ads on. They have ad placements to sell. An advertiser is somebody who has ad creatives. They're looking to get traffic by running advertisements. And creatives are really the actual ad itself, but it's kind of wrapped up in JavaScript or possibly an iframe that contains a bunch of the functionality around tracking and attribution. A demand side platform and a supply side platform, you kind of think of these as essentially trading bots or automated trading bots that trade placements and bids on those placements with creatives on an advertising exchange, which is kind of a marketplace for those things that runs an auction. And an ad server is the server that both the advertisers and the publishers use to manage and deliver their advertising creatives. So I said that this was a simplified view. This is the simplified view, unfortunately, and it is long and complicated, but let me just quickly do the rundown so that you know what's actually going on, or at least have some view of what's going on. So when a browser first connects up to a publisher site, we begin to download HTML. There's some JavaScript in there, oftentimes in the headers, and that JavaScript connects up to their ad server, the publisher's ad server, and that ad server knows about the ad placements that are available to sell, and it has some information about who it can sell those to, the partners. And one of those things that it might be doing is it might be doing some programmatic ad sales. And in order to do that, it talks to what's called the supply side platform, which is the system for managing communication with ad exchanges and other partners that are doing programmatic. It's actually more than just ad exchanges, but for our purposes, we'll just talk about that. And it figures out what the constraints are around putting those ad placements up for auction on the ad exchange. So it talks to the ad exchange, it puts those placements up, it puts that impression up, and the advertisers, they have the converse, the demand side platforms, which they use to submit bids. And this entire bidding process happens in around 10 milliseconds. They all are required to put their bids in, and whoever has the winning bid, as determined by the ad exchange, they get to determine what creative gets shown. So they pass the information about where that creative is, what that creative is, down through the ad exchange to the supply side platform, which goes to the publisher's ad server. Publisher's ad server, as the response to the original GET request for the JavaScript being run within the headers of the original HTML request, as the response, what it ends up with is some running some and executing some JavaScript, which itself says you need to go off to the advertiser's ad server and retrieve this creative and insert it in line and render it. And so that's what happens. That JavaScript runs, it goes and gets the creative from the advertiser's ad server, and in the process of doing it, the advertiser's ad server tracks the impressions so the advertiser knows that the creative was served and that they got what they paid for. So you're probably going to be dealing with one of these two cases, and let's talk about the first one for a little bit here, because I think it's probably the one that most people are interested in, and we'll cover the last one towards the tail end. So the first and kind of biggest thing is that you have an application, you have a site, maybe it's a mobile application even, or a web application that your organization wants to monetize via online advertising, and you need to figure out what the security implications of that are. And so you've got that that application or that site. It's got ad tags injected into it that you need to know and understand. There's an ad server that it'll be communicating with. Maybe you're hosting that, maybe you're not, maybe it's external. There's probably a supply side platform as well, although not necessarily, but we'll assume that there is for this. And it might be hosted internally or it might not as well. So let's talk about some of the things that can go wrong. They really kind of come down to three major sort of groupings of thing. Ad fraud, malicious content injection, and my grab bag category of other things. The ad fraud one, there's sort of like three, I guess, main types of ad fraud that affect publishers. Not the only types of ad fraud that there are, but these are the ones that affect publishers. Malicious content injection is probably the thing that most people are thinking about when they're thinking about the security implications of ad tech. So we'll kind of cover that off, and then I'll hit some of the other sort of like weird things that maybe people who are used to dealing with regular web applications don't necessarily think about as being security issues, but in fact are. So ad injection. Ad injection is a type of fraud where essentially browser malware or a malicious plugin inserts a fake ad. Inserts an ad into the page of the publisher, and the fraud here is the publisher is not getting paid for the ad. This is somebody else who is essentially using their site to generate their own money, and the publisher's not getting paid for that. Sometimes you see a variation on this based on very subtle defacements, where the defacement itself is not done for glory. It's done to subtly change publisher IDs in order to be able to defraud the publisher. So I would say your reaction to this is really kind of two things. There are some ad fraud protection vendors out there, and you probably want to look at some of them in order to be able to detect those malicious plugins and malware. And part of the reason why you might want to be doing that is because you are selling those ad impressions, you're selling that traffic. And if it is fraudulent, one, you're not going to get paid because they may have done an ad injection. But two, if it's fraudulent in other ways, you're not going to get paid, and it becomes a reputational risk. So you probably want to look at one of the ad fraud vendors. Likewise, just be aware of those subtle defacements, that not all defacements are done in a very loud, flamboyant way. Sometimes those defacements are just changing a single identifier so they can steal money very quietly. Cookie stuffing has been around for a while. It really comes down to, once again, kind of stealing money by manipulating those publisher IDs. I'm going to kind of mention this a few times, but the ad tech ecosystem is very little in the way of authentication. And you are your publisher ID at the end of the day. Whoever can change that publisher ID gets paid. And unfortunately, the way that people track that is via cookies. We all know all of the problems that cookies have, especially being passed around in a sort of a cross-domain way. And anybody who can manipulate those cookies somewhere along that path, or via, say, a cross-site scripting attack on your site, or can subtly steal revenue from you. And because of all of the issues around cookies, and because of some of the privacy issues around them especially, it's become very typical to give subdomains out for the publisher's main domain to various other participants within the ad tech industry in order to be able to pass those cookies around and access them. And this can be incredibly dangerous because, of course, any one of those participants who has a security issue or is dishonest can manipulate those cookies as they pass by, and you don't get paid for your traffic. So domain spoofing is, I think, in some senses, I feel like it's the most interesting one for people who don't participate in ad tech, because they may be being defrauded despite the fact that they're not even running any ads. So with domain spoofing, the fraud is that somebody purports to be running ads on your site, and they're not. And so they create fake traffic purporting to be on your site. It's not actually on your site. And they get paid, and you are probably none the wiser. But essentially, they're making money on your reputation and on the back of what you've built without you ever taking any of that. So the fraud there is just essentially not being paid. Um, the industry has come up with a couple of ways of dealing with it. Ads.txt and appads.txt are the two standards that you kind of want to look at, and I would advise everyone to take a look at those standards and consider putting one on the root of their domain to make sure that nobody's claiming to be them and sell traffic based upon them. It really ends up being a bit of a reputational risk. So, malicious content injection affecting publishers. This is sort of the meat and the potatoes, things that people really kind of care about here. Malvertising is the one that everybody knows. Obviously, we are injecting JavaScript into your site. It is cross-site scripting as a business model. And if you don't trust the people who are delivering those creatives, to deliver non-malicious creatives, you have a real problem. And this comes down to making sure that the place that you are getting those creatives from, the exchanges you are working with, the partners that you're working with, have some form of malvertising detection vendor themselves and can spot those malicious creatives, spot that malvertising. Reputable exchanges will be able to tell you exactly what they do in order to keep that malvertising off their platform. Ask. On your own side of things, there's a standard called Iab Safe Frame. It's essentially an iframe that wraps your ad tags and prevents it from doing some communication out to the publisher's site. It can be a way of helping to prevent this. It is not a panacea, and it breaks certain types of workflows, so you may or may not be able to use it. You should definitely look at it and understand it, though. URL parsing and macros. I want to talk about this because I think it is a really interesting place to find vulnerabilities that people don't think about. So the way ad techs are typically implemented is, as I said, script tags. They're GET requests for the script tags. And data is typically passed either as cookies on that GET request or very often in the URI parameters of that GET request. But oftentimes those URI parameters, they want them to be dynamic. They want to include things, say, for example, the campaign idea. They don't want to hard code it every time, or they want to be able to know where the traffic originated from. So they want to pass the referrer for this particular request log, or maybe there's an issue passing cookies between domains. So they want to get a value out of the cookie and push it into the URI parameters and pass it along that way to the next step in the chain. However, that happens, and it happens in ad tags, it happens in creatives. There's a bunch of places where this sort of ad hoc protocol exists. You get various vendor macros, and they're generally simple substitution macros. There's generally a colon separated tag right in the middle of the URI, and it is replaced. It does simple string replacement in that URI. We all know what happens when you do simple string replacement. SQL injection has taught us that over and over and over again. And all of the same sort of issues are here, but you can get some very subtle vulnerabilities, both because the content of those macros might themselves be URIs that also contain macros that then might be injected, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, ad infinitum. But also because the results of this can result in some very subtle cross-site scripting or even SSRF issues, as those URIs are often trusted in ways that they really shouldn't be. So I think I mentioned before, but really redirects and proxies are everywhere in here. There are scale issues that lead to proxies, load balancers, web caches all over the place in order to deal with that scale. There are redirects everywhere in order to be able to pass cookies between various participants. That's a very common tactic. So everywhere you see one participant, oftentimes it's actually a bunch of participants all being masked as the one, where you go to the one and it's actually a redirect to another, which is a redirect to another, which is a redirect to another, all pushing cookies along and adding their own information to the request as it goes along. Because subdomains are a really popular way of being able to do that cookie passing, you need to be really aware of cross-site scripting and phishing issues around that. Open redirects are an incredibly common way of doing this too. We report open redirects all the time, and the business is like, yep, that's how it works. That is working as intended. It can make things really difficult. And on the other side of things, from the protection point of view, your web application firewall might not be able to understand what advertising looks like. It looks like an attack. It looks like cross-site scripting a lot of the time. So you may have to really tune it for this traffic in order to get protection there, or you might not even be able to use it. Likewise, your regular sort of like preventing various components from talking to the rest of the internet and only allowing them to talk to each other, because it's very typical to bounce traffic between participants off of the originating browser. You can't do that. Ad traffic comes from everywhere and anywhere, and you can't really block it very easily, which is also sort of unfortunate. Some other security issues, which we'll just touch upon quite briefly here. HTTP is still everywhere. The large ad tech ecosystem participants are pushing for HTTPS. They've actually done really, really good work with that the last year or so. But it's still all over the place, and all of the usual issues around request smuggling, around DNS hijacking, those are all over the place here as well. You need to be aware of. And we've, of course, got way more protocols than the ones that I've just sort of mentioned so far. I'm not going to talk about VPAID and VAST. All you really need to know about is if you ever deal with video advertising, you will need to understand those protocols. They are XML and JSON based. Sometimes they wrap each other. I've never seen a correct implementation of either one. They are notoriously terrible. And almost all the vendors have either their own protocols or their own twists on the standard protocols. Which can cause all sorts of issues as well. Because a lot of these things are working in low latency environments or working in high scale environments, oftentimes the parsers around them are very custom, with all of the dangers that entails. You should definitely be aware of that. Because you can find out the hard way when your security scanner crashes all of the ad tech when you ran over it, because the parser is super fragile. There's also some trust issues, as I sort of mentioned and alluded to before. Authentication is essentially completely lacking. There's some of it, but it's not, it's not very good between the various participants. Likewise, some of the ad tech that we use is not itself amenable to a lot of the web security tools that people are used to having. As an example, source integrity just is not generally usable because the JavaScript itself is just so mutable. And I'm not even going to talk about the privacy issues. It's too big a topic for this. But a lot of the security issues that we fail are caused by the reaction to privacy issues. So the second use case, with your marketing department using online advertising to drive traffic, you're probably going to have a demand side platform, or they will, and an advertising server to serve up your creatives. And you're going to need to understand how those work and what the security implications of those are. Really, this comes down to three things: yet more ad fraud, phishing, and some attacks on the infrastructure and protocols. So let's talk about the ad fraud that can happen when you're buying. This is really fake traffic, fake and fraudulent traffic. As anybody who's ever found out that you can get paid for traffic by advertisers has, I'm sure, thought, they think to themselves, well, I have curl, I'm going to get paid. And thus the first ad fraud bot was born. Uh, there's an entire industry of ad fraud that is huge. There's an entire industry of dealing with ad fraud that is similarly huge. What you really need to know is you need to have an anti-fraud vendor, and all of the participants you deal with also need to have an anti-fraud vendor, and you need to make sure that they do, because at the end of the day, this is a game of making sure that your counts of traffic that came in match your upstream providers and so on and so forth, and that everybody agrees what's fraud and not getting paid for and what's not and is getting paid for. You'll also need a brand safety vendor, because even if the traffic's real, you probably don't want your brand showing up on a porn site, for example. Phishing works a little bit different than I think probably the usual enterprise end of things does. Um, Account compromises can be super damaging, because really you need to think about this as almost like a financial market, where wire transfers are how the money's going in, and then bots are trading that money in order on that marketplace. And because of that, those accounts can be incredibly valuable. They have real cash that they're spending in an automated fashion all of the time. And you need to protect those accounts. You need to protect the things capable of doing wire transfers. And all of the best practices from PCI compliance really should probably apply, but generally don't, because of the B2B nature of the business. But you should be looking at those things and you should be thinking about it. Finally, attacks on the infrastructure and protocols. Um, so on the whole programmatic side of the advertising industry, the default protocol is a thing called OpenRTB, Open Real-Time Bidding Protocol, and it is essentially a web server protocol, and it kind of works a little bit like webhooks. The thing to know about it is it's generally HTTP still. There's some HTTPS, but it's generally HTTP. JSON is generally the default format, but it might be binary. And because it works in a context where it is required to deal in 10 millisecond latency for the responses, almost everything about it is built from scratch with performance languages like C, and you will see it being very, very, very fragile. You should spend some time making sure that you are comfortable with what it is allowed to talk to and whether or not its parser is able to deal with the traffic that it will be exposed to from a security context. And because these things are oftentimes run by people who are non-technical, they're run by marketers. Don't forget about the user permissions, because there's an entire side of user permissions that also has to be taken into account. Here's some resources and further places to explore. The IAB is sort of the standards body for the internet advertising industry in general. I've included their main standards link here, as well as the ones for the Safe Frame and ads.txt. OpenRTB is actually now an IAB standard, although it used to just be an open source project amongst a bunch of vendors. And then Prebid is probably the biggest open source pre-header bidding system, which is a really good way of understanding how the bits that actually live on the publisher's site themselves work, and a good way of being able to delve into that for more information. Hopefully this has been useful and interesting to you. I know it's really just an introduction to the topic and there's so much more to dive into, but we have a limited amount of time. So hopefully I can answer some questions, and that will be useful to you. Thank you very much.